right.
Maybe he's God.
Yeah. If you're just joining us, welcome to Life and Text with Rabbi Goodman. We've had all manner of Zoom chaos this morning. We've really enjoyed it. From screen sharing mishaps to, this was a Saturday Night Live skit, basically. If you haven't seen the Saturday Night Live skit in Zoom mishaps, it's been really something. But we're learning. We're all learning. We're 6 weeks into this, and we still haven't figured it out. All right. With that being said, I'm going to show up my handy dandy counter. We're talking about counting of the Omer, which shows up in this week's Torah portion, Parshat Emor, for Life in Text this week. Counting the Omer, for those who are completely unaware of it, is going back to the biblical period in which for 49 days between Passover and Shavuot, a new sheaf of barley was brought as an offering to the temple and quote unquote sacrificed. And during that time, they counted the days in which that happened. Now, there are many reasons for this. One is the new barley harvest was a big deal because there was fresh food for everyone, fresh grain. Another is the more biblical, or going back to the story of Exodus, was we are counting the moment between Passover and Shavuot, the so-called 49 days at which the Israelites traversed from leaving Egypt to arriving at Mount Sinai, right? So Sinai is this important moment for the Jewish people, and the 49 days between are like this countdown. But we are actually counting up, which is this interesting thing. The counting of the Omer is done day by day. It's a strange mitzvah amongst the 613 commandments, in the sense that it is a commandment by which we are all commanded to kind of count the Omer. We literally just have a commandment to say that we're going to count, and then we count, and that's it. And I made this handy dandy thing for myself. Today, for instance, we would say, Hayom Shiva ve'esrim Yom Shehem Shlosha Shavuot Ushisha Yamim Ba'omer. It's a custom in Judaism to count at night, typically when 3 stars appear, although at Beth Shalom, our rabbi has given us the guidance that we can do it at Ma'ariv, even if 3 stars haven't appeared. And if you don't fulfill the commandment of counting at night, you count during the day. You fulfill the commandment that way. So yeah, that's a little bit about the counting of the Omer. We count up and not down, which is an interesting decision. We count at night and not during the day, which is an interesting decision. We don't say Shehechianu when we count, which is an interesting decision. And our rabbis are very interested in all of this. So with that, we're going to kind of turn to our text. So if you have a text, you're going to want to either pull that up or just look at my screen, which I'm sharing with us now. And our screen is here. Okay. So it says, this week's Torah portion starts, or has in the middle of it, Usifartem lachem mimacharat hashabat miyom haviachem et Omer hatznufa sheva shabbatot tmimot tehiena. And from the day on which you shall bring the sheaf of elevation offering, the day after the Sabbath, you shall count off 7 weeks. They must be complete. So interesting. The word safar is going to be the one that our commentators are most interested in. They're really fascinated by just why the word count. And so there are lots of ways of kind of diving into it that are a little bit more personally meaningful, that'll allow us to kind of enter the mitzvah, which, as I kind of alluded to, is really simple. All we do is count. All we do is say a number, and then we're done. That's the mitzvah. I, as a custom, you can see on the bottom in the Hebrew, I add the sfirot, the 10 divine spiritual Kabbalistic emanations, as a mystical practice. And I'm fairly knowledgeable about Judaism, and even I'm kind of mystified and perplexed by what's going on by doing that and what it means. So trying to find an entry point into the counting of the Omer, this very simple mitzvah can be very difficult. The idea that I am fulfilling a commandment by saying a number out loud feels weird. I think it's relatable to this concept of quarantine, of figuring out what is the meaning of being in quarantine and just kind of grinding out a day, counting out these days, counting out these moments. What meaning does it have in my life? Can I think, and Marilyn said this really well, can I elevate the day that I am in rather than just say I'm grinding my way towards the end of being trapped in my house? Or am I just counting down or counting up? So with that, we're going to take a look at the text. Our text here starts with this statement by the Maharal. So the Maharal, most famous rabbi of Prague, Czechoslovakia. If you've ever been there, he has a very famous synagogue that belonged to him, the Alta Shul, in the center of Prague. It's the oldest living standing synagogue in all of Europe that was not destroyed, because it was not destroyed by the Nazis. The reason being, the Nazis decided that if they exterminated all the Jews, they wanted a museum in Prague to the people who were exterminated, to this destroyed culture of Europe. And so the Maharal, his synagogue was not destroyed. The other thing the Maharal is famous for is all the stories of the golem. In the 1600s, he purportedly, late 1500s, he purportedly took the mud of the Vltava River and squished it together and formed this giant 10-foot high, beast, and wrote Emet on its head, inscribed in the holy mud of the Vltava. And then he took a secret Kabbalistic parchment and slipped it into the golem's mouth, and the golem protected the Jews of Prague from attack. That's the story of the Maharal. It's, myth or legend. But he was a real person, the Maharal, Rabbi Yehudah Loew of Prague, and he was famous for all of his Torah that he taught, which is a little bit mystical, a little bit practical, I would say. A really brilliant rabbi who was kind of a man of all, he was a jack of all trades amongst rabbis. He gave legal proclamations, he gave Dvar Torahs and understandings, and it was also a little bit mystical. He precedes the Baal Shem Tov, so he is not a Hasidic rabbi, but he presages some of the things that the Hasidim would kind of explore because he was rooted in Kabbalah. So an interesting dude. And he says this. I don't know if Ilanit or Nitzan would like to read this. Would either of you? That's not Nitzan. That's Meital. Meital, would you like to read in the English? It's short.
Meital's not going to read it. Nitzan, you want to read? She's deeply engrossed in ABC Mouse Academy.
You're up.
All right.
So, and count for yourselves, and then the next piece.
All right. And count for yourselves from the day after Shabbat. You shall bring the Omer, the elevation or wave offering. Why do we count 49 days from the day of bringing the Omer until the day of receiving of the Torah? It alludes to what is taught in Pirkei Avot. If there is no flour, there is no Torah, and if there is no Torah, there is no flour. From the Maharal of Prague.
Nice. So there is this beautiful idea that he brings. Imein kemach in Torah, imein Torah in kemach. It's a famous line from Pirkei Avot. And the basic understanding of that verse in Pirkei Avot is that you have to have a worldly occupation. You have to do the dishes. You have to take care of the kids. You have to get up in the morning and brush your teeth and comb your hair and put on your clothes. And there are lots of practical aspects to life, and being purely ensconced in Torah is not the end-all be-all of existence, right? Studying Torah is important, but earning a wage, making your daily bread, literally and metaphorically, is important too. And so the Maharal is doing this nice move where he's saying the 49 days of bringing barley offering every day connects Torah to daily life, right? You've got to go out into the fields and you've got to harvest the wheat. You've got to harvest the barley in order to be zochen, in order to merit receiving the Torah. All right, great. With that, we're going to turn it over to Joe. Joe, if you don't mind, we're going to read the next commentary. This one's a little bit longer, and it kind of cuts off in the middle without ending because it is, did I give over who it's from? It's from the Yisroel of Rizhin, the Rizhiner Rebbe, who was a Hasidic Rav of the mid-19th century. So, Joe, will you read this, what you see on the screen right now? And I'm going to add his name in at the bottom.
And count for yourselves is related to the word sapphire. Thus, one must purify and cleanse their thoughts like a sapphire. From the day after alludes to the concept of faith, for a person cannot know what will come to be tomorrow. Rather, they must trust in the Creator, that God will give that person life and strength tomorrow, just as they gave life to them today. Each and every moment and hour. And this is, and count for yourselves. A person should make pure everything that comes into contact with yourselves, like their body or their material appetites. From tomorrow means that the power of faith and belief is that one believes in life, in words tomorrow and beyond.
Nice. Okay, so there's a lot going on in this one. Let's pull it apart a little bit, and then I'll take your kind of questions and comments after we pull it apart. So he's got a problem. The Rizhiner Rebbe has a problem with the concept of why safar? What's this word doing here? It's a strange choice. And there are also, by the way, the other move that he's making, if you want me to pull apart the move for you, is there are other words in Hebrew and in the Torah for count, right? In fact, the book of Bamidbar opens with a census. And the word for take a census of yourself or count for yourselves is not the word safar. So there are other words that could have been used here for counting. And this is not it. So where does the word safar also appear? So the most famous place that it appears is, you have to kind of go down to see it, is the word sapphire, which appears in a story in Exodus 24. If you I'm scrolling up for you, you'll see that I kind of hand wrote it on the side of the page. And the verse there is where it says what Moses saw when Moses ascended to see the throne of God. And it says that Moses saw, quote, a pavement of sapphire under the throne of God. And the phrase that's used there is livnat hasafir. We're going to leave not till a little bit later, but saphir in the Torah means sapphire. So, okay, so we get this move. So now the question is, what's the connection between safar, count for yourselves, and sapir, okay? So gems, as we may or may not know, need to be cleaned in order to be, and polished, in order to be really valuable, right? If you don't polish a diamond, it basically looks like a clunky glass rock. It needs a lot of polishing, and all gems need cutting and polishing in order to be gems. So too, we must purify and cleanse not only our thoughts, but as he goes forward, our actions, our behaviors, the way we go about. So the next thing that he kind of talks about is usapartem lachem memachorat, cleanse or count for yourselves tomorrow, right? And that's a weird phrase too, right? We don't count the Omer by counting what happens tomorrow. We count today. We count the day. By the way, this word macharat was basically read by the rabbis as this day forward, which is why the rabbis in halakha decide that it should be done in the evening at the earliest moment, because we are counting for the day to come. So if you've always wondered, why are we so strict on counting at night? It's because the rabbis wanted us to count now and look forward. But he makes a move here that's more metaphorical, which is this move of talking about counting forward is the true act of faith for the Jew, right? We are counting that the sun's going to come up tomorrow. We are saying that a great asteroid is not going to strike the earth. I'm not going to die in my sleep, right? There will be a tomorrow. to quote Annie, tomorrow is only a day away, right? It's basically this idea of tomorrow as a brighter future, or tomorrow is going to exist. In light of all bad things, the sun's going to come up, is another way of saying it. And the Rizhin Rebbe is saying this is an act of true faith, that the Jew wakes up every day and says, tomorrow is going to happen. And I have that with emunah shlema, with great faith, that tomorrow is going to exist. I think in the time of a pandemic, we can understand that feeling, right? Existence feels like it's holding on by a thread a little bit, and life feels a little bit more precarious. And the act of a Jew who is faithful is to trust in the Creator that God will give that person life and strength tomorrow. I don't know for sure what's going to happen to me. Everything feels a little precarious. Life is a little scary right now. I'm going to use emunah, I'm going to use faith to move forward and say, there will be a tomorrow and tomorrow and tomorrow. Every day there'll be a tomorrow. The power of faith and belief is that one believes in life, and then he does a really interesting move that I'll pull apart for you. He says, in the Hebrew, he says, Memacharat b'koach ha'emunah shehu ma'amin b'chei ha'olamim. Okay? So I did a freestyle translation of that by saying chei ha'olamim is in worlds tomorrow and beyond. For those of you who are really literate and knowledgeable, you know that chei ha'olamim is a little bit more ethereal as a concept, right? You could say that it is, there will be a tomorrow in this life, but chei ha'olamim probably means we're talking about the world to come, right? That life beyond this life. So for those of us who feel like now is a precarious time and we may not make it, or not everybody is going to survive this pandemic, which that is a fact that we cannot put aside. Another act of faith that the Jew engages in is the belief that this is not the only world, that there is a world beyond this one, and that for those that are faithful and righteous, that we will go on to chei ha'olamim, to a life eternal. That's a bigger move. That's a greater leap, and it may not feel comfortable for everyone, but that's the move that the Rizhiner makes. That counting, the act of counting, is about the act of human refinement. And the act of human refinement is an act of faith. And the act of human refinement and faith is an act in trusting in God and God's commandments, and that there is a reward for them now and in the world to come, right? So I just he in a few lines makes a number of big moves, right? He moves from we count to refine yourself, to there's a future, to have faith, to if you have faith, you will live in the world to come. And it's a lot of moves. You may not have bought this text, you may not have loved this text, but I think that it's an interesting text to kind of explore concepts in what you do with usvartem and count for yourselves, when maybe just the pure act of mumbling a bunch of numbers off of a piece of paper and saying, I fulfilled the mitzvah, is not enough for you. It's about the act of human refinement of your thought, deed, and material self. All right, any thoughts, questions, comments, complaints about this text up till here? Nobody. Everybody is. Joe had a line in the commentary, which is, who is the they in reference to God? Why are they referring to God in the plural form? Let me go back and see what you are talking about. And I also don't know what line 5 is. Joe, can you help a little bit by remembering or sharing what that might be?
Well, you took away the screen.
It's back.
Okay. So
they gave life
5
today.
So line 5 is just as they gave life. So
great.
That's the they.
Let me go back and see if I didn't just translate it really poorly, which is entirely possible. Oh, yeah, it's a mistranslation. It says Hu habore sheyiten lo machar chiyut v'koach, that God gives to us. I could have just said God gives to the person. So my bad. Any other thoughts?
Okay, so as long as we're on the subject, um, the, the word creator was used here. I imagine that's a translation as well. But it makes me wonder whether creator and God are completely synonymous in our religion.
Nice.
When we refer to a creator, uh, do we mean God and vice versa always, and it's indisputable?
I would say yes and no, in the sense that that's a great pickup in the sense that, and a word that I skated over, which is there are lots of names for God, and this time God is referred to by the Rizhin Rebbe as Bebore or Habore. And it's clear that he is hooking our existence and our thankfulness and our need to refine ourselves to the fact that God creates us and that we're kind of potentially in God's debt for that reason. I would say that God is always God and God has all God's aspects, but when a commentator invokes one of God's specific names and one of God's specific attributes, like the creator God, it's interested in that aspect of the divine by saying the creator God is the one that I'm most thinking about when I think about the counting of the Omer and the refinement of my own actions. But it's an interesting question. Why choose that one? It could also be accidental. It could be that the Rizhiner just prefers to call God by the Bore, as the Bore. There are lots of names for God, and wondering how intentional any one of them is a good question. I think it's probably intentional, but you could also say maybe it's just the Rizhiner's favorite name for God. Any other thoughts on this text, which is a bit of is kind of a wild one. There's no doubt, but it's kind of a wild one.
It's heavy, it's deep.
It is, and it's an attempt to find something in this simple act. You know, and it's an attempt to hook it to something pretty profound, which is death, and life beyond. All right, with that, let's go on to the next text. This one is short and related to the last one. I think the book that I took it from hooks them together without even a paragraph break. So if you don't mind, Audrey, do you mind reading this one for us?
Sure.
Great.
And count. The Tzemach Tzedek, Rabbi Menachem Mendel, the second Lubavitcher Rebbe, said regarding a quote of rabbis of the Talmud, why were the early rabbis called Sofrim? Because they devoted so much time to the Bible. The first sages were called those who count Sofarim because they would count all the letters in the Torah. Sofrim is also from a pavement of sapphire in Exodus 24. They illuminate the letters and they illuminate hearts.
Okay. Oh. Great job. So that's your, if nothing else, if you tune into this class, not for the weird, complicated text, but for the super awesome bumper sticker texts, the stuff that I like to put out on Twitter that are really good, I don't think it gets any better. Your big payoff line for today is they illuminate the letters and they illuminate hearts. That is a banger of a line. It is just a brilliant concept. But we have to, let's take it back and unpack it. Let's start by talking about who the Tzemach Tzedek is. So there, as we talked about in this class before, there are 7 Lubavitcher Rebbes going back to the town of Lubavitch in the Ukraine in the 1700s. The first Rebbe was a student of the students of the Baal Shem Tov, basically making him a second generation chassid. His name was Shneur Zalman of Liadi. So in fact, Lubavitch wasn't founded in Lubavitch. Lubavitch migrated there from the town of Liadi. And the guy who migrated there was a guy by the name of the Tzemach Tzedek, who was the adopted son of the first of Shneur Zalman. Shneur Zalman named his child Menachem Mendel Schneerson. So Menachem Mendel Schneerson was the second Lubavitcher Rebbe. As you probably many of you know, that's also the name of the seventh Lubavitcher Rebbe, which is why we never call this guy Menachem Mendel. We call him the Tzemach Tzedek, which was the name of his book, which means the righteous flower or the righteous blossom. And he looked at this verse in Kedushin 30 of the Talmud and made the move. So before we had the move that the word sipartem, and you should count for yourself the Omer, was related to sapphire. Safer, siper, right? That's the move. Now we get a different move, sofrim or sofer. And sofer, the word sofer is, you probably are also familiar with, people who write Torahs. But back in the era of the Talmud referred to some of the earliest rabbis of the Talmud as the sofrim. And the question is, why did they get called the sofrim? In fact, the Hebrew word that's used here is, why were the Rishonim called sofrim? Why were the first rabbis, who were also called Rishonim, called sofrim? And the answer is because one of the holy acts that they did was counting all the letters in the Torah. And actually, this verse in the Talmud, in Kedushin 30, goes on and says, talks about how the Sofrim counted to the middle letter of the Torah, and it's this letter, and they counted the first letter of the Torah, and they counted the last letter in the Torah, yada, yada, yada. But one of the acts that they did was just doing the mind-numbing accounting practice of counting the letters in the Torah. And then he makes the move to the pavement of sapphire. What's holy about the act of counting the numbers is that it brings them light, right? Counting the letters is a way of understanding them, right? Giving each and every letter its due by saying this letter was the 1000th letter of the Torah. And trying to shine other light onto the Torah by doing the mind-numbing work of counting them. Another way of saying that, if we were talking on a slightly different angle, is to ask the question, what is the Kedusha? What is the holiness of the individual who verbatim rewrites the Torah letter for letter, right? I don't know if you've ever thought about this, but I think a lot of us think of a sofer, the person who handwrites the Torah, as a very holy act. To be very blunt, it's also a really mind-numbing act, right? It is the same as when you were a kid in elementary school and you did something naughty and you got sent to the blackboard and you said, I will not spit on in the trash can. And you had to do that 500 times. I don't know about you guys. I don't know if any of you ever got that punishment. I actually got that punishment, not often, because I was a really good kid. But, if you've ever gotten the punishment of rewriting something onto a blackboard, it's pretty mind-numbing. It's not fun. It doesn't feel holy. So sifrut, the act of transcribing a Torah word for word, letter for letter, can feel mind-numbing. But it is also an act of calligraphy. It is an act of beautification and an act of elevation. And there's a sense, one of the classic Hasidic lines that is recounted from the Talmud is the phrase that the Torah is black fire on white fire, that there is something inherently spiritual, inherently elevated in the letters. And they're making this move because I think it's really cool to say that counting the counting of the Omer is simple and it seems low or unimportant, but in reality, it's a very high act. Mind-numbing, mundane acts can be high if you elevate them, if you look at them on the microbial level, right? If you take a look at a Sefer Torah, and if you look at the letters contained within, they are meaningful. This is also a riff off of what Marilyn said, but an inversion of what Marilyn said. If we count our days, as in the days of quarantine, in order to discount them, isn't that an interesting phrase, right? If we count them in order to discount them, right? To make them like, crap, let's just get out of this boring quarantine, then we are invalidating them. But if we look at them on the microbial level, and if we elevate them, then we are illuminating them. We are giving them light, right? The word in Hebrew for illuminate that I translated is vehe'iru. It's from the root word in Hebrew, or to give light. If we give light to the letters, then they illuminate hearts. So the other thing I wanted to point out, which is in the, I think if you're getting screen share, you should see this bolded, is this thing that I pointed out, which is it just says they and they. And it's a little unclear who the they is. It says, and they could both be the Sophrim or the early rabbis. So it could be they, the Sophrim, illuminate the letters, and they, the Sophrim, illuminated our hearts. Or we could be talking about the letters themselves. It could be that the first they is the Sophrim who illuminated the letters, and the second they is the letters themselves, which illuminate our hearts, right? Torah and the illuminating, the mere transcription of Torah and the letters themselves bring light to our souls. They bring light to our hearts, and they help us to know and understand what we are supposed to do in the world. All right, with that, we're gonna, any comments on this text, any thoughts about this one? It's a neat one, right? It's a neat kind of concept of like digging in. All right, Marilyn, go ahead.
No one appreciates the significance of putting letters together to make words more than I do. But I'm having a real problem with this particular text. And believe me, those who are so careful in reproducing the Torah letter by letter have all my respect in the world, because their care is to make sure that the words are correct in the end, that it isn't that. So my problem is exactly what you said. What they are saying in this passage is the antithesis of what I said before. And that is that the counting has a meaning in and of itself. And I don't, for all that I am a counter, I don't agree with that per se, because what it does is it pulls you away from the meaning. It doesn't pull you closer to the meaning, it pulls you away. Whereas I see the scribes who do the Torah as being pulled into the Torah, I see what he's saying is pulling out. And so that's why I disagree with it. And you're right, it's the exact opposite of what I said way back at the beginning. So I'm having a little problem with this particular argument.
Yeah, I hear that. I personally feel like there's a holiness to editing that is kind of forgotten. It may be that this is on my mind because I'm writing and I do some editing of my own work, and not having an editor, for some of my writing sometimes means that I make mistakes that get published online anyways in soccer articles. Yesterday, I was at the book reveal of a friend who wrote a young adult book called Turtle Boy about a 7th grader. And, he got on Zoom and he had his editor kind of talk about, and his writing coach talk about, helping refine his work. And so, I that's kind of on the brain for me right now, the holy work of stringing letter after letter together to make a word. But here it's about early rabbis who were pulling apart the letters to find deeper meanings within them.
And counting them so that they know which one is which number letter in the whole Torah takes away the meaning of the word that the letters represent for me. I see that as completely deconstructing and disassembling the significance of the word itself. And that for me is very problematic.
Yeah, it's like Derrida. I don't know if any of you have studied any philosophy, but Derrida used to was a philosopher who liked to take the literal meaning or the actual meaning of something and then pull it apart.
Deconstruct it. And I don't agree with the deconstructionists at all, even though, yes, I have had to study them and sometimes refer to one of the few gems that they come up with. But that's exactly the problem I'm having here. To know which is exactly the middle letter of the Torah is less meaningful to me than the significance of the word in which that letter appears.
Nice. just to finish the thought about who Derrida was, my favorite thing that kind of illustrates what he used to do was he wrote a book where he laid two books that were completely unrelated to each other side by side against each other. And he was trying to say, potentially, this one book affects this other book in the way you read them, even though they literally have nothing to do with each other, right? If you took The Joy of Cooking and you opened up Dostoevsky's Crime and Punishment, and read them side by side, you might derive things that were not intended by either author, but they are now there because I just deconstructed them and put them there. Marilyn is making the argument that's not a good way of reading text. The Tzemach Tzedek is saying the attempt to pull apart is an attempt to illuminate. Phil, you wanted to say something. Go ahead.
Yeah, just in response to Marilyn, whose opinion I greatly appreciate. Sometimes when a rabbi is telling me this means this because of these numbers of their letters, I can understand why sometimes it feels convoluted or like you're really going around and about to make your own point. But I would say, and Rabbi, you could probably give more specifics, but there are just so many teachings and so many of the things that rabbis through the generations have taught us based on those seemingly random deconstructions of finding where every letter is. So I think like whether or not that is humans giving themselves an excuse to find some information, if the end goal is a holy message, then you can't separate it totally.
Yeah, I mean, one of the things I briefly mentioned to Marilyn offhandedly was Marilyn's not going to like the Zohar, which is the mystical book that studies the Torah, which we studied, and she did actually about a month ago. We learned it, and you did like it, I think. But yesterday I was learning with Rabbi Marquise.
I have a copy. I've read it. That doesn't mean
Right. Yesterday I was learning with Rabbi Marquise, and we were talking about somehow we got into a Kabbalistic, sidebar. And we started to tell stories about my Kabbalah teacher, who is, ironically, it's a good transition to our last text, was a student of Rav Joseph Soloveitchik. But he also was a child of the 60s. He dropped a lot of acid. He was a real, San Francisco beatnik who was, kind of clicked into that entire world while also being an Orthodox Jew. And Rav Giller studied Zohar after he learned all the basics of being a rabbi from Soloveitchik. Soloveitchik, from the extremely legalistic, rigid, the words mean what the words mean school of thought, Kabbalah being the opposite. And in the time that Rabbi Marquise was at the Ziegler School, they had created concentrations. When I was in rabbinical school, you had to learn 60 pages of Talmud and then take a test. And if you didn't learn those 60 pages of Talmud and test properly, they wouldn't call you a rabbi. In Rabbi Marquise's time, you were allowed to test on any body of Jewish literature that you wanted to. You did not have to do Talmud. So Jeremy had a colleague named Marcus who tested on Zohar. And was a Kabbalah concentration. And Rabbi, this story is building. Don't worry, it's all related. And Jeremy told me yesterday that Marcus, at the end of his 60 pages of studying the Zohar, he was weird. He was a little unbounded. He was kind of like, he went a little crazy, was the phrase that he said. And Jeremy talked to Marcus about it and said, "How are you feeling?" And he said, "I think I'm losing my mind, and I think I need to come back now. When this DAF exam is over, I'm going to stop learning Zohar for a while." And the reason is, Jeremy doesn't have as much experience in Zohar as I do, but he does know a lot about a lot.
I'm in here.
And what Jeremy said was that what Marcus said was, and what we were talking about is the Zohar has no floor, right? when we study Torah, when we talked about usipartem lachem memacharat, that verse means, and you should count for yourselves the days of the Omer. The Zohar has no baseline of understanding. Anything can mean anything in the Zohar, and the meanings of words can change according to the last text they study, and then it can change again and again and again. And at some point, everything becomes relative. And there's a, as you can kind of understand, there becomes potentially a moral relativity when, you know, a phrase about adultery no longer means anything about adultery. When a phrase about murder is no longer literally meant to mean murder, then the crazier rabbis of their time could say, murder's relative. Adultery is relative, right? Theft is relative. And it doesn't literally mean that. It only figuratively means that. And so suddenly you've become unbounded. So to Marilyn's point, becoming too unrooted from the origin of the text is problematic. That being said, a good Kabbalist reroutes themselves, right? Can say it means that and it means that. It can mean both things at the same time. So that's to Phil's point. Paula, you wanted to say something like an hour ago and we didn't get to call on you. Go ahead.
Well, I have two things now, but what you're saying now, doesn't that have a lot to do with context? The same phrase means different things in different contexts. And you can't lose sight of that when you're translating it or thinking about what it means. But what I was thinking before about the deconstruct, I know very little about the Hebrew language. My vocabulary is extremely limited, but there are so many small root words and each letter changes that root and makes it something else. So you don't have a deconstruct, you have a construct.
Right.
And I'm seeing it as a building it up, not tearing it down.
That's a beautiful, brilliant observation from something I may have mentioned in this class at some point, which is Hebrew as a language is a poor language. The Bible itself has something like 5,000 different root words. Modern, later Hebrew winds up with about 50,000 different kinds of words. And modern Hebrew came together and had something like 150,000 different words for things. English, by comparison, I was once taught, has 1.3 million words for things. So there's an economy of language in Hebrew that is also a poverty of language, which also leads to your point, Paula, which is that you have to make meaning out of certain words and expand upon them because the words didn't have enough meanings already. I find that I have to use a thesaurus to translate certain words different ways in the same text. I believe I did it already just down below. I actually translated the same Hebrew word with two different English meanings because it just fit better to say it one way than another. So meanings and words have to be relative because otherwise you may not be able to get at the guts of what really is being expressed.
And to me, that's a construct, not a deconstruct.
Yeah, and I think Derrida would probably have agreed with you, even if he may not have liked it, potentially. That deconstruction is an act of construction. All right, any other comments before we go to this way more literal, practical text? We're over time a little bit if you're the person of the mindset that this is a 1 hour class. I don't think we ever advertised this as a 1 hour class, but you know, there are no rules, and Zoom got us all messed up at the beginning. So we're really not in overtime, really in normal time. But if you have to go, I always understand. This next text we're going to look at is way different than all this weird Kabbalistic deconstructivist stuff that we've talked about. It is, as I mentioned, a text of Rav Joseph Soloveitchik. So Soloveitchik is famous for philosophy. He wrote a fairly important book called Halachic Man, which was a kind of a rereading of all of Judaism through the concept of how we derive philosophy from doing the commandments. Another book that he was really famous for was a book about two different concepts of Adam. That Adam was created alone in one teaching, and Adam, I'm going to stop screen sharing so that I can see you all. Adam was created in Genesis in two different tellings. Once all alone, and the second time Adam was created with Eve. And it's an existentialist read of Torah. It's called The Lonely Man of Faith. It's a beautiful, brilliant 100-page work about what it is to have existential loneliness within Judaism. Brilliant. I've never seen anything else. It's parallel. That was Joseph Soloveitchik. He grew up in a Brisker family of Torah, a very rational, literal read of Torah that was always trying to solve the problem that was before them and do it in a legalistic way. And that was Soloveitchik. The other thing, if you Google Joseph Soloveitchik and look up his Wikipedia entry, it has a really neat one-sentence description, which is to say he basically creates modern orthodoxy. He isn't the founding rabbi of YU, of Yeshiva University, but he gives YU its soul. And all of modern Orthodox rabbis today basically say, I was a student of Soloveitchik, or my understanding of Orthodoxy comes from Rabbi Soloveitchik. To that degree, modern Orthodox Jews today do not refer to him as Rabbi Soloveitchik taught me. They refer to him as the Rav. Means the rabbi, right? The one and only, right? So,
Boston girl here. I was the administrative director at Maimonides for 3 years. So I would meet him every time. He would come in twice a year to do a shiur. And of course, I worked with his daughter all the time because she was head of the school committee. But an extraordinary man.
yes.
Extraordinary.
A voluminous writer of philosophy, of Torah commentary, the administrator of an organization, and also just a brilliant legal decisor. So the back end of our Torah portion has this verse that's on your page. I'll do all the reading for you guys as usual. Shever tachat shever, ayin tachat ayin, shen tachat shen, ka'asher yiten mum ba'adam, ken yinatain bo. So Leviticus 24:20 says, fracture for fracture, eye for an eye, tooth for a tooth. The injury he inflicted on another shall be inflicted on him. So we have this verse in the Torah, which appears in 4 different places, twice in Leviticus, once in Exodus, once in Numbers, which is pretty rare that you get a concept in Torah that shows up in 3 different books of the Torah. And it's here, it says, hey, Iggy, how's it going? Iggy's getting paper. And it says basically that the concept is an eye for an eye, right? The pshat of eye for an eye, the simple meaning of eye for an eye is what we've all heard many, many times, which is if a person stabs out your eye, you should stab out their eye. If they break your hand, you should break their hand, right? The Latin phrase for this is called lex talionis, the law of the talon, which means that physical injury should be compensated by physically injuring the injurer, right? But it's problematic for obvious reasons, right? As Gandhi once said, an eye for an eye leaves the whole world blind, which was a brilliant concept, but also misunderstands potentially the Jewish Torah view of what eye for an eye means. The rabbis immediately come and eliminate the understanding that eye for an eye is to be meant literally. And they take it apart and make it mean something more metaphorical, which we're going to look at briefly here. Okay, so the Hebrew is above here, and my English translation is below. Eye for an eye, tooth for a tooth. Eye for an eye, financial compensation. Rabbi Eliezer says it is literally an eye for an eye. Quote, how can one argue literally? Said Rabbi Ashi, Rabbi Eliezer means to say that the court does not appraise the injured party as if he were going to be sold as a slave. Rather, they appraise the one who caused him in damage. All right, so time out. What's going on here? In the Talmud and Bava Kama is the entire section of Talmud that deals with the question of injury law, right? So for those of you who are ambulance chaser attorneys or have ever dealt with personal injury law, you may be familiar with this. You may be entitled to financial compensation, right? The Talmud says that eye for an eye's literal meaning is financial compensation, that it never implied that one should literally poke out the eye of someone who intentionally pokes out your eye, right? One rabbi says, no, it literally did mean that, and that's Rabbi Eliezer. Rabbi Ashi says that can't be. It's not possible. Ashi is a later generation Rabbi Eliezer. He says that literal eye for an eye is actually not about poking out eyes. It's about who we assign appraisal value for. So the standard value of way we evaluate the price of a physical injury is what a slave in a marketplace would get if they were damaged, right? So if your average slave would be sold for $1,000 in a marketplace, a physically capable slave, and another slave comes up and they're literally missing an eye, what would a person pay for that slave in deference to the other slave? If the answer is $900, then we know that the value of an eye is $100, right? Rabbi Ashi is saying that Rabbi Eliezer is saying that that's not what we're doing. That's not the math that we should be doing. It's not that we should appraise a person based on the value of the slave in the marketplace. We should appraise the value based on the eye of the person who committed the damage in the first place, right? Meaning, if I poke out Shirley's eye, God forbid, right? We don't say, what would Shirley have gotten in the marketplace as a slave missing an eye? We instead appraise the value as, what would Rabbi Goodman pay to have his eyesight back, right? What would Rabbi Goodman have paid to have two good eyes again? And if the answer that Rabbi Goodman comes to is $100, then he should give Shirley $100. If it's $1,000, then he should give Shirley $1,000. Okay, we're going to keep reading. The Rambam says, an eye for an eye is financial compensation. This is the law from Moses on Sinai. And one could ask this question. If so, why does the Torah even bother to say eye for an eye and not just money for an eye? Okay, by this we're meaning, the Rambam says it is literally, eye for an eye literally means financial compensation, and that's what it always meant. And that's what God told Moses on Sinai. There is no literal meaning of the poking out of the eyes. The only understanding is financial understanding. And then Soloveitchik has the problem, right? Why would the Torah even bother by saying eye for an eye if it never literally meant eye for an eye? A very logical question, right? What's going on here? And he goes through this very methodical reasoning. And he says this. The reasoning is this. If the Torah had taught money for an eye, kesef tachat ayin, it would have given the impression that human body parts are nothing more than things equal to money, their value merely financial. And if one wounds one of the limbs of their fellow, it could be replied, so what? I'm paying your doctor's bill, right? The Torah comes and says, eye for an eye. Regarding the doling out of justice, the injured party in truth should be assessed in the eye of the perpetrator. The punishment must be equal to the crime, measure for measure. Okay, so to Soloveitchik's point, if we had just said kesef tachat ayin, money for an eye, we have this danger that people would not regard human limbs with the same value that we do. They could say very callously, if I got into a car accident with someone else and they lost a limb in, God forbid, in the car accident, I, as the perpetrator who caused the car accident, could walk up to the person and say, what's your problem? I gave you $500 for your arm, don't cry about it. But rather, we should understand that we should step into the injured person's feet and understand and into their shoes and understand what it would be like to be missing an arm or missing an eye at that point in our lives. We should say, oh my God, if I was missing an arm, it would be way more of a big deal to me than being out $500. It would be a life-changing moment. And I should understand it that way. It is financial, but I should also empathize. He keeps saying, If one takes from their fellow this great act of chesed that God gave, that act of giving a sight, it is fitting that the punishment be that sight is taken from them, right? We should understand another person's situation like we were made blind. Therefore, the Torah refines this law according to the Rambam. It is fitting that one takes away one's limb, but the Torah affixes that it is instead compensated. And this is what Rabbi Eliezer is saying. Eye for an eye, literally. This does not mean that you pluck out an eye, literally. Rather, you find out from the perpetrator to compensate not for the eye of the injured party, but rather for the value of the eye to the perpetrator themselves. For in truth, it is needed that they pluck out the eye of the perpetrator, right? So we have this interesting kind of understanding. And I just thought this was really neat. It is way less deep and metaphorical and spiritual than my average Rabbi Goodman stuff. But I still thought it was pretty cool in the sense that it gave a really good answer to a problem that Jews are confronted with by people who are not particularly Torah knowledgeable all the time. What, Rabbi? It says eye for an eye, and that's so offensive to me. God forbid it should actually say that. Your religion is stupid and it's punitive and it's angry and the Old Testament God and blah, 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 blah. And the quick response is it never meant that. And it could never have meant that. And the reason it could never have meant that is because this concept of plucking out an eye is so bestial and so violent that God couldn't have meant that way. There are layers within layers of what it might have actually potentially meant. Of course, I openly acknowledge that this is rabbinic layering on top of our original meaning, but this rabbinic layering is critical to our understanding of what Torah says. Okay, Joe's got his hand up and then Marilyn. Go ahead, Joe, and then Rana. Or maybe Rana has to go. If you have to go, I understand. Joe, you're on. I have unmuted you. Go ahead, Joe. And you're remuted. And I can't unmute him.
That's what his wife says too.
I had a little trouble with the mouse pointer there. Just did not want to go on that unmute box. Anyway, without agreeing or disagreeing, I just simply point out that an eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth is practiced regularly in our world today. And one example of that is our response to the World Trade Center coming down. We took out Osama bin Laden because he killed us.
Yeah, and the concept of vengeance is not anathema to the Torah, I think. Eye for an eye is a concept that gets used in a different way. So the rabbis are very interested in restricting eye for an eye to a halachic category that winds up in the Bavas and Bava Kama and the other two Bavas in the Talmud. And they are reduced to the legal problem of tort law, right? Like what happens when my ox gores your cow, or when I'm swinging an axe in the forest and I accidentally, strike you in the shoulder and you're bedridden for 8 weeks, right? Like the rabbis are focused there. But
so you're saying the rabbis are focusing on accidental loss?
They do and they don't. They also deal with both. They deal with both the accidental injury and they deal with, two guys who get into a bar fight and one guy blinds the other guy in the fight, right? Like that guy pays this kind of recompense that we're talking about. What they don't get into is what you were talking about before. Only later rabbis do it, and they tend not to focus on the concept of revenge. But vengeance is generally frowned upon in Judaism, but not exclusively. There are definitely texts like this one that are used by the Jewish world to back up why we should, when we get pissed off or when people drop bombs on us, we should drop bombs on them.
What about the bar fight? So you punch me, I punch you back. He loses his eye.
Right. The classic text also in Torah that's used in that context is the rodef, the person who pursues you and attempts to do you harm, or you intuit that they're about to do you harm. The text records it as, if a person gets up to kill you, kill him first. That's what the text says. So it's a little bit about vengeance, and it's a little bit about self-defense.
So if I get into a bar fight and I take out someone and someone takes out my eye, me trying to then follow up 30 days later by taking out his eye, that's not what's implied by this particular line?
Not according to Rambam's read, not according to the Talmud's read, but there are other commentators, and Rabbi Eliezer, you could argue here, is reading, yeah, go back to the bar 30 days later and knock out his eye. Bava Kama generally frowns upon that because of a number of legal decisions that it makes about why ayin tachat ayin, eye for an eye, can't be legal. One of them is, I think, very compelling, which is, if a guy knocks out my eye in a bar fight and I have to wear a patch for the rest of my life, and the court decides, okay, you get to go back and pluck out his eye next week. And I go and we all stand on a street corner, I take a knife and I plunge it into his eye. And I go a quarter inch too deep and I stab him in the brain and he dies. Then we attempted to do eye for an eye and I accidentally committed murder, which is one of the 10 commandments. So the Talmud recounts as one of the reasons why eye for an eye is illegal, that eye for an eye is a nice idea, but if you attempt to do it in real life, you might accidentally do more than eye for an eye. You might wind up committing more harm. Same with, if you cut off a guy's hand, he might bleed to death. So the rabbi said eye for an eye cannot literally mean eye for an eye, because an eye for an eye leaves, forget about Gandhi, a whole world blind, an eye for an eye leads to murder, right? It's not a practicable law. That was their take. All right, Marilyn, you wanted to say something? And
Because this particular passage has always fascinated me on a linguistic level. And linguistically, it suggests it was never meant to be read literally because of the absolute equivalencies. In other words, it is also putting a limit on, you cannot take back more than what was taken from you, that equivalency. And so if you read it very carefully and look at the constant repetitions of linguistic equivalency, what you see is something that is never intended to be taken literally and always intended to be understood in terms of setting limits. There is, you can take too little and you can take too much. And so the eye for an eye, tooth for tooth, what it is saying is you cannot go either less or more than. And I always read it as being intended as metaphoric and not as literal because of the rigorous linguistic precision of the repetitions.
yeah.
And so
Someone as well read as you, Marilyn, I'm surprised to hear that.
Why?
Well, the general consensus is that this language was standard in ancient Middle Eastern codes of legal conduct, and that it literally meant an eye for an eye.
I would say maybe way back before this was written down, but once people start writing, whether they intend to or not, in the backs of their minds are the thoughts that lead to those linguistic structures. And yes, the linguistic structures certainly do evolve in the time frame in which they are written. But what you're seeing there in that particular construct is actually a set of limits on either side. And I think that's what you're hearing in all the rabbis' commentaries since, is that they're recognizing that problem.
I'm going to add a layer to that, which is one of the frequently said lines in Torah that appears in different places is the concept that you shall have no greater or lesser in judgment, meaning, and you shall not favor the poor nor the rich in judgment. And it's to Marilyn's point that the concept that eye for an eye could have meant and no more and no less was really important, right? You know, I get into a bar fight with a guy and I take his eye. And the court comes to me and says, pay him $50,000 for the loss of his eyesight. And I say, Judge, I'm broke. I can't afford to pay $50,000. How about $25,000? It's not about whether I can pay. It's not, it's not, his eye is not worth less than another person's eye just because I'm broke. And the reciprocal is also true, right? He shouldn't, he can't argue, my eye is not that important. I'm not a really big important person, and therefore, my eye is not valuable. That's an argument that the Talmud also gets into, which is is the eye of if you permanently debilitate Michael Jordan at the height of his basketball prowess versus Joe Schmo, there's a difference. Modern America values those two people different. Potentially the concept of eye for an eye would have said, no, they're not. Pay both people a lot of money. Go ahead, Marilyn.
I was going to say, but and to take that and actually just transfer it back to what Joe is suggesting, and imagine if the rule for that society was that every time you accidentally took off somebody's arm, your arm had to be taken off, and pretty soon nobody would be able to till the land. Nobody would be able to build things. No one would, no houses, no structures. And so I think that even if you think of it contextually, way back before this could have actually been written down, that people would have understood that at some point that becomes suicide for a culture, for a community, when everybody is then no longer able to function. So this has to be seen as setting up some kind of equivalency to rationally keep the community going.
Joe, you get the final word, and then we're going to call it a day.
Yes. So I think what Mark is talking about is, what did those words mean when they were incorporated into Torah?
Mm-hmm.
But those word constructs, an eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth, go back hundreds, maybe 1,000 years in writing before Torah was written down. And the consensus of historians and archaeologists today is that the first written utterance of those words, it was literal. If you take out my eye, you get your eye lost. But when it comes to what the founding fathers of what we call Judaism meant when they wrote it down, Moses or whomever, that's up to open for discussion.
Oh yeah.
Great.
Absolutely agree.
Thanks, you guys. I hope you enjoyed class today. Hopefully I'll see you next week, and Shabbat Shalom, and enjoy day 27 of the Counting.
Don't.
Thank you for keeping my brain active.